the organizing committee, Abbas and Carolyn, and especially Cy Mouskoff for arranging this timely discussion and the opportunity for me to share my family story. I first met Cy when I was a freshman here at Duke and undeclared, had no idea what I wanted to study or do. And I happened to take one of his history of science courses. And as a result of that coursework, I ended up majoring in history, and that helped inspire my senior history honors thesis in leadership in academic science departments at Duke. I also really appreciate this opportunity because it encouraged me to have deeper conversations with my parents and other family members, which is something I should have done a long time ago, but I was incredibly grateful for that experience. So my story is basically starts with my great-grandfathers on both sides of the family. My paternal great-grandfather was from the West Indian state of Gujarat, and his family were farmers there. And during World War I, he was a teenager and decided to seek a better opportunity beyond farming cotton and rice. And he went on a boat to East Africa, is where he ended up. And that was a time of some chaos as it was transferring from German to British colonial rule. He found work there in a clothing business in the capital of Dar es Salaam and learned entrepreneurship and in turn opened his own clothing business. After he'd established that business, he returned to India. His family was quite surprised to see him as they thought he had passed. He married there, and he and his wife returned to East Africa. Back in East Africa, they raised 8 kids. He expanded his business into coffee, and my father was born there in 1950. On my mother's side of the family, they were also farmers in Gujarat, and my maternal great-grandfather was there. And so as a young teenager himself, his grandmother was interested in his seeking opportunities beyond what were offered there to their family of farmers. And there happened to be a businessman who lived in Malaysia but was visiting India, a nearby village at that time. And my great-grandfather's grandmother borrowed money from family and friends to pay this businessman to take my great-grandfather back to Malaysia and help set him up there. So in 1930, he went with this businessman. He left his wife and my grandfather, who was only a month old at that time, behind in India. And then he found work in Malaysia selling cloth on his bicycle from village to village. His wife and his son joined him a couple of years later. And then they actually sent my grandfather back to India to obtain some education. And so my grandfather was in India, back in India, doing some schooling. He got married and then had planned to return back to Malaysia to join his parents. Unfortunately, World War II intervened at that time, and so there was the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia. So he actually found himself farming for several years, waiting until things were safe to return to Malaysia. They were able to return back at the end of World War II in 1946, and there he joined my great-grandfather selling cloth on their bicycles until they were able to open a store to sell cloth in a village in Malaysia. And feeling they had adequately settled my grandparents in Malaysia, my great-grandparents returned to India around 1950, and my mother was born shortly thereafter in Malaysia. So my father's family was in East Africa, my mother's family was in Malaysia, and they actually both found their ways back to India for education. So in my mother's case, in Malaysia, there was a scarcity of opportunities for further education. There wasn't a lot of investment in education, I guess you could say, on a societal level there. There was also some difficulties involved with distribution of seats in the available educational opportunities based on things like ethnicity. So my grandparents had really saw education as a portal to opportunities for their kids. And so that ended up being abroad for their kids. My uncles studied in Scotland and New Zealand, and my mother ended up going to India for medical school in 1970. In my father's case, in East Africa, similarly, a lot of difficulty with higher education opportunities, especially with his status as a quote-unquote foreigner at that time. So my paternal great-grandfather, who I started the story with, actually helped my father apply to medical school, and he was lucky enough to get in and went to India around the same time as my mother. In India, both of them were introduced by a family member's friend, and they began a long-distance romantic relationship via train between the cities where their medical schools were. As they completed their medical school and some training and got married around 1980, they looked forward to their future prospects. I found this very interesting, but they both felt like outsiders in India and didn't feel like they wanted to develop a future or raise a family there. They thought about going to Malaysia, where my wife's family was, but the immigration laws of that time would have made it difficult for my father to both immigrate there as well as practice medicine there. And so what actually happened here was family support. My aunt, my father's oldest sister, was a nurse in New Jersey at that time. And my parents grew enamored with the prospects and the promise of coming to the US. So in 1981, they were lucky enough to be able to immigrate here. And here, when they got here as foreign medical graduates, or FMGs, they had to complete further medical training in order to practice medicine and serve here. But as FMGs, it was a challenge. They had minimal choice in picking their actual specialty or even the location of their training programs. And they applied to hundreds and hundreds of programs. And my dad ended up doing oncology training in Buffalo, New York, my mother psychiatry training in New Jersey. So for the first several years they spent in the United States, they had to live apart. I was born a couple of years later, and for the first year plus of my life, my parents were actually living apart. When I was 3, we moved to the small town of Dalton, Georgia, probably not that different from Shura, where for the job opportunities there. And what actually made the difference in choosing Dalton over some other places was the fact that they had a family friend. And of course, this was, a relative, a cousin's friend from their village in India kind of thing. But that's what made the difference, and that's actually why we ended up there. And I grew up there until coming to Duke for undergrad as a freshman. And so when I asked my parents about the difficulties and challenges they faced on coming here, obviously the applying for medical training and being apart those first few years is a big one that sticks out. But beyond that, they really focused on the positive, the promise that being here meant, the opportunities that it led to for my sister and myself. So they really focused on that. And when I do push them on, what was difficult, what were the challenges, it's not language or racism, being in the Northeast with snow and cold after growing up in tropical climates, or even the difficulty of being vegetarian at that time. They both talked about how difficult it was to learn how to drive a car. And thankfully, they're much better parents than they are drivers, but that's what sticks out. All in all, it's a very positive experience with how far they've come, despite some of these challenges along the way. And so there are a few things that stuck out to me about this process going through this story. The first was the leap of faith that my great-grandfathers took in leaving India to go to Malaysia and East Africa. That was something that took courage. It wasn't the easy thing to do by any means. The second, and I think this is a sentiment we'll echo today, is this emphasis on education. Even if it meant sending their children or grandchildren away and abroad, they really viewed education as a portal to opportunities and to moving forward or finding a better life. And finally, and I thought this was really interesting, various members of my family regarded Malaysia, East Africa, even India as areas or places where they felt like outsiders or foreigners. And I've never heard any member of my family talk about the United States that way. I think it was a great contrast to how they feel about the US. And that's something I think informs our discussion today in a big way. I just wanted to end with one slide about what I do professionally. Just one slide is it. And so I study the esophagus. And so I see patients with things like difficulty swallowing, heartburn, chest pain, things like that. And a lot of times, disorders that can cause these include things like reflux, eosinophilic esophagitis, or disorders of esophageal muscles, things like spasm or achalasia. And so I study diagnostic modalities we have to better identify these disorders and help manage patients with these symptoms. And I just want to talk about 2 of these without getting too granular. The first is esophageal manometry. This is a thin catheter that we place through patients' noses into their stomach. It's a short test, not as uncomfortable as it sounds. But the sensors, the pressure sensors on this catheter can be converted into these topographic plots where more intense colors correlate with higher pressure. And this is an example of a normal swallow. But in contrast, we can see something like achalasia, where food doesn't move through, and the sphincter muscle that leads to the stomach doesn't open. We can see a definite difference there. And the second is pH impedance monitoring. So when people have suspected reflux, we want to sort it out, we can put a catheter down that has a pH sensor on it. But by adding impedance sensors on the catheter that measure the resistance to flow of current, it allows us to see when something is present in the esophagus. and whether it moves antegrade like a swallow or retrograde like a reflex event. In addition, we can see the pH of this bolus when it's there, as well as whether it's associated with patient's symptoms. So these modalities and the metrics they provide really help us sort out these symptoms, diagnose these disorders, and make patients, direct them to appropriate treatment. We are doing a collaboration with engineers through our MEDEX program here at Duke about developing a wireless device that might be equipped with impedance sensors and allow us to get a lot of this benefit without some of the discomfort associated with having a tube in your nose for 24 hours. So that's it. Thank you again for this opportunity.